Very good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for coming for our session today. Today is the first Research Edge session for the semester. So we're going to have another interesting semester. We have lined up a lot of interesting presentation for the semester. Over the last 1 year, in fact, over the last semester, the number of attendees and presentation have increased tremendously in the Research Edge session. So I'd like to thank everyone who have been supporting all our presentation over the past many months, even during the period of the lockdown. So today we have another two very diverse and interesting presentation today. The first presentation, race, gender, and incarceration in the colonial Bahamas, going to be presented by Dr. Ulentin, Assistant Professor of History in the Department of History, Philosophy, and Religion. And then we also have the next paper on the science of artistic expression, neuromechanics, and piano playing from Dr. John Cunningham, Assistant Professor of Music at the Department of Performing Arts at UBS. So two different kind of presentation, which is really going to be interesting. I'm sure we are going to be learning a lot of things today, and I'm not going to take much of the time. I know our time is limited. So I'm going to now hand over the session for the first presentation to Anne. Let me stop sharing my screen so that you are able to share your screen. Okay, I see your screen. You have to unmute.
Good afternoon, all. Thank you for being here today. For the sake of time, I will be reading my paper entitled Race, Gender, and Incarceration in the Colonial Bahamas. In post-emancipation years, the fundamental structure of Bahamian society had not been altered. The Black majority remained dominated and socially ignored by British officials and the agro-commercial oligarchy. Colonial authorities continued to stereotype the Black laboring classes as ungovernable and generally lawless, while legal mechanisms that criminalized the laboring classes were further defined and expanded. As colonial states expanded and consolidated their power and sought to tighten their control over their internal population, the penal system in the Bahamas in the mid-19th century served to secure labor and, by extension, maintain the socio-racial order that prevailed before emancipation. Aside from labor coercion based upon racial domination, the colony relied heavily on penal labor as a form of punishment immediately after emancipation and through the 20th century. Penal labor being the generic term for various kinds of unfree labor, which prisoners are required to perform. Contemporary gender norms inform the treatment of female and male prisoners, as male prisoners typically labored in gangs on the streets of New Providence, while female prisoners remained at work inside prison walls. Furthermore, the colonial state constructed a penal regime with stated goals of rehabilitating prisoners and reforming their character through penal labor. Aside from the economic incentive, penal labor included a reforming aspect, as it was believed penal labor would teach the prisoner a moral lesson. These ideas about the role of labor and its ameliorative benefits circulated widely in the British Caribbean. Penal labor and other forms of labor were thus consistently advanced as a solution to criminality and formed a key part of penal policy and discipline in the Bahamas through the 20th century. In the 1880s, the local administration insisted, quote, "Imprisonment alone would be no punishment," and the quote is on the slide. "There appears to be no better mode of dealing with the class of criminals which we have than of subjecting them to sharp and severe treatment for the short time they are in prison, unquote. Through the debates around punishment, the colonial elite elaborated discourses about the nature of Afro-Bahamians and constructed racial forms of punishment in the process. In the British imaginary, Afro-Bahamians were colonial, racialized subjects who were different from British subjects, thus requiring a different treatment before the law. The Black body and Blackness thus informed the ways in which men and women were treated. This particular understanding of race and racial difference is exemplified by the language used by Sergeant Major James Jamieson, who in 1874 brought to the attention of the Colonial Office the plight of incarcerated white soldiers in the Nassau prison, who, in his opinion, were treated inhumanely, working long hours in the sun. He bluntly affirmed, quote, "The scale of punishment has been framed especially for the Black man," unquote, making it unsuitable and unjust for white soldiers to bear. Such ideas about race and punishment set a pattern of mass criminalization of the Afro-Bahamian population. The general increase and nature of crime in the colony was always of great concern to colonial officials, and they often highlighted the presumed reckless nature of the population and their resulting indulgence in crime. The Afro-Bahamian population was thought to be lawless, ignorant, and blindly indulging in crime, supplanting any attempt on the part of the colonial elite to, quote unquote, civilize colonial subjects. Scholars underline the same type of discourse in other parts of the British Empire, where colonial officials juxtaposed the Afro-descended population and other non-white populations against an imagined civilized, implicitly British group with a much deeper respect for the law. A process of otherness was at work as people came to be seen as criminal and irreformable as a whole. In the Bahamas, conviction and incarceration rates remained high throughout the colonial period, and new charges and stiffer penalties further criminalized the Afro-descended population. In the late 19th century through the first half of the 20th century, several thousands of Afro-Bahamians were reported to or arraigned by the police for various offenses every year, resulting in new charges that criminally implicated between 3 to 4% of the total population on an annual basis. On average, about 40% of those charged were convicted, receiving sentences that ranged from fines, imprisonment and hard labor, flogging, and other punishments. Charges fell into the following categories: offenses against the person, predial larceny, offenses against property, and other offenses. This category, other offenses, represented the largest proportion of offenses and included minor, non-violent offenses, such as abusive language, drunkenness, and other various minor breaches to colonial laws. The majority of prisoners were sentenced to short prison terms, as shown by Table 1A on your screen. So the majority of prisoners were sentenced to short prison terms, less than 3 months. And the majority of prisoners were reoffenders, as shown by Table 1B. So overall, the data reveals that on a daily basis, thousands were arraigned by the courts and convicted for petty offenses, while thousands were confined in the prison. In terms of gender, a high proportion of women were committed to the prison. Based on colonial records, women were kept separate from men since the construction of the first workhouse. On average, as shown by Table 2, over 3 in 10 persons incarcerated between the 1860s and the 1930s were women, So again, a high proportion of women being imprisoned. Placing incarceration rates in the Bahamas against other nations allows us to contextualize the high imprisonment rate. Historically, incarceration rates in the colonial Caribbean were high. In particular, historians have drawn attention to high conviction rates and high incarceration rates in Trinidad, in Jamaica, and in Barbados. Table 3A provides the number of persons committed to prison in those territories, including the Bahamas, per year for selected years. Do note that even though the committals for the Bahamas appear smaller, smaller than Trinidad's, Jamaica's, and Barbados's, they're actually not, as the total national population has to be taken into account when analyzing this kind of data, which is why Table 3B is actually a better tool of measurement. Table 3B shows the rates of incarceration per 100,000 of the national population. And in this case, I used rates for the Bahamas and the United States. As you can see, again, this is table 3B. The Bahamas' rate of incarceration well surpassed the US's. For example, in the 1860s, incarceration rates were 5 times higher in the Bahamas, while in the 1930s through the 1970s, the discrepancy between Bahamian and American incarceration rates deepened. So these tables showed that mass incarceration was certainly a key feature of the colonial Bahamas criminal justice system during the colonial period. And I can say more during the Q&A, if need be. Furthermore, towards the late 19th century, racial and gendered understandings of violence and criminality led to the emergence of new forms of punishment, as rehabilitative imprisonment, as it was called, was abandoned. In particular, as the laboring classes and prisoners were believed to be inherently violent, corporal punishment, or even the mere threat of corporal punishment, was seen as the best deterrent to violence and crime. The same trend was underway in other parts of the British Empire again, in particular in Jamaica, where flogging was considered a natural choice and a more effective deterrent than was imprisonment. This change was tied to changes in British ideas of penalty, and corporal punishment was integrated into a so-called modernized penal system, as imprisonment was no longer accompanied by high hopes of reconstructing the personality of the inmate. However, as historian Diana Payton points out, corporal punishment in British colonies took on a different character, different from Great Britain. Harsh penal measures and corporal punishment in Great Britain, quote, were understood to be a way of dealing with a hardened criminal minority of the population, the dangerous classes, end quote. While in British colonies, including the Bahamas, imprisonment and flogging were a rough and ready form of justice based on racial domination. While colonial authorities delivered sentences of summary imprisonment with hard labor and or corporal punishment to mostly petty offenders, the latter could also be punished for violating the rules of the prison with little recognition of their rights. Prison officials seemed to possess a blind faith in the power of corporal punishment to control and reform prisoners. They exclaimed, quote, after it was found that prisoners were getting violent and out of control, the cat was again used and effected an immediate reformation, end quote. Time and again, they contended that the mere knowledge of the existence of such punishment had, quote, a most salutary effect, end quote. As stated before, Racist paternalism and ideas about Black masculinity informed the treatment of male prisoners. And the racial characterization of Afro-Bahamians as uncontrollable and associated fears of attacks contributed to the emerging belief that flogging was a particularly suited form of punishment. Similar ideas about race and punishment circulated in other British colonies, as stated before, including South Africa, where colonial officials held similar views and argued that, quote, the faculties of reason of African subjects were not sufficiently developed to allow them to be punished without at least some degree of physical coercion, unquote. Incarcerated Afro-Bahamian women were not subject to flogging. Still, racist and sexist philosophies informed the treatment of Black women. As demonstrated earlier, the discourse about punishment was gendered in the British Caribbean, and as a result, quote, even though in the face of corporeal equalization of Black men and Black women, and the particularly pejorative categorization of Black women, the notion that these same bodies were somehow different from each other and should be treated accordingly impinged on penal practices. Thus, the need to mark the female criminal as different from the male criminal was not only reflected in a structural sense, it also found expression in the types of punishments meted out to confined men and women, unquote. Aside from hard labor within the confines of the prison, the other identifiable gendered form of punishment was hair cropping. The use of hair cropping remained the corresponding punishment for females, as exemplified by the following quote, quote, now and then a prisoner of desperate character did turn up, but his attempts to set at defiance the authority of the prison were soon checked by the application of the lash in the case of a male and of the shaving of the head in the case of a female offender. And these punishments invariably produced a tranquilizing effect upon these turbulent spirits and reduced them to order and obedience, end quote. Thus, just as flogging was considered to be one of the ultimate deterrents to crime and ensure a so-called reforming effect on prisoners, hair cropping was utilized to control and reform the hardened female offenders. Colonial Secretary E.B.A. Taylor reported that such punishment, quote, proved its efficacy in several cases when the women had exhausted every effort to reduce them to obedience, and that none other punishments had had so deterrent an effect as this. I knew of 2 desperate characters whose sense of shame was aroused and who never returned again to the prison. They are quiet women now, unquote. Women were considered more unruly than men, and colonial officials frequently emphasized the disruptive character of the female side of the prison. Female prisoners were found to be more difficult to manage than the male prisoners, forcing prison administrators to resort to punishment. The latter blamed increases in prison punishment specifically to the fact that women knew they could not be flogged and became uncontrollable as a result. Women were thus believed to be particularly unmanageable and intractable prisoners. As historians note, this idea that there was a particular brand of criminal, the incorrigible female, was also discernible elsewhere in Jamaica, in Trinidad, in Barbados, etc. These women of worse character were thus viewed as different from the male criminal, and gendered forms of punishment were required. One such woman was Julia Johnson, a so-called old and hardened offender who had been convicted multiple times and punished multiple times for breaches of prison discipline. Johnson's hair was cropped as a result. And according to prison officials, the benefits of head shaving were instantly felt, as Johnson, quote, had not been seen or heard of since, unquote. While hair cropping was utilized sporadically in the 19th century, flogging was maintained as a prison punishment well into the 20th century. It has also remained a lawful sentence to this day in the Bahamas. The prison administration continued to believe that corporal punishment was a deterrent to violence inside the prison. And as crime escalated in the 1930s, prison officials sought increased powers to order corporal punishment as a penalty for various crimes, and to extend the powers already existing in the Bahamas to impose corporal punishment. In the 1950s, they claimed, quote, most of the cases where corporal punishment was awarded were cases of violence. There are many cases of violence, too many, both inside and outside the prison. Cases of violence arising in the prison have been greatly reduced since corporal punishment was authorized for this type of offense, unquote. The insistence of colonial prison officials on pain as the only language of deterrence comprehensible to Black prisoners not only revealed that ideas about racial difference were embedded in the colonial fabric of power, but also that Black subjects could no longer be reformed. Again, according to local and prison officials. To conclude, this study shows that the prison was a core part of the punitive and disciplinary landscape in the colonial Bahamas, and that additional forms of punishment were used in tandem to discipline and exert control over the population. Above all, colonial prisons, such as the Bahamas, functioned as spaces to inscribe otherness and enclose those deemed undesirable from the rest of society, while preserving the social order by reinforcing the race and gendered inequalities that existed on the outside. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for an interesting presentation. I think there's a lot of questions or chat discussion that is happening. So it's going to be difficult for me to post a question based on the chat. So maybe you want to look at the chat, and because some of it are discussion which I think you can add on to the discussion that is going on in the chat. With regards to, I think that one of the things that is put up there is on the statistics that you have shown there in trying to compare the Bahamas with the other islands and even the US in terms of the rates of incarceration per 100,000. And do you think a number like that is really giving the true picture? Because we are a country with a small population. So the probability of the numbers being very high is there. So if you see this figure here, rate of incarceration per 100,000. So the graph basically shows that we are even worse than the US. But does this figure really capture the essence of where we are in terms of our population and the makeup of our population?
Right, exactly. I have to do some more work when it comes to this table 3A. But like you just said, our population in the Bahamas is much smaller than that of Trinidad, right, Jamaica and Barbados. So if we take the 1870s, for example, even though the committals, right, appear smaller than Trinidad's, we have to keep in mind that Trinidad's population during that same time period was 4 times larger than that of the Bahamas. So indeed, mass incarceration was definitely a major key feature of our criminal justice system at the time during the colonial period.
Okay. Prison violence reduced after corporal punishment. I wonder if they could have tried other tactics. Okay, some comments that you see.
Yeah, there are a lot. So I just saw what does CO mean in the citation for the quotes. So this speaks to the kinds of sources that I used for this particular study. That means that refers to the colonial reel. These are colonial records that are on microfilm, found on microfilm at the Department of Archives on Mackey Street. So these are the colonial records for that time period. And in addition to these colonial records, sometimes you find separate prison records. So you will also find that type of sources in there.
Hair cropping as punishment. That's interesting as well.
Right, there's too much for me to address at this point. The last comment points to women who collaborated with the Vichy government, who had their hair cropped at the end of World War II, actually. This is not a new phenomenon. In addition to this, in prison elsewhere in the world, women also had their hair cropped. So it's not just about race, it's about gender here. In particular, there's a recent study that looks into Irish prisons and hair cropping in Irish prisons.
Interesting that public shaming was punishment for women as opposed to men.
Right, but at the same time, corporal punishment was also done in public, right? So men were flogged inside the prison, but people could witness, right, what was going on in the prison, just like when prisoners, well, they were not prisoners just yet, but when men were convicted for a particular offense, let's say imprisonment and corporal punishment, they would be flogged also in public, right? This would not be done behind closed doors like it is now. This would be done in public.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any more pressing questions? You're free to also raise your hands if you want to directly ask or give your comments.
What is flogging?
What is flogging? Is that the question?
Yes, ma'am.
Flogging is whipping with a cane or a rod or the cat. The cat is short for cat o' nine tails. So it's a whip that was used well during slavery and that was still in use after slavery was ended. Today it is a cane that is used and not the cat o' nine tails. But during the colonial periods, the cat was used to whip males.
Okay.
And please feel free to reach out to me if I have not addressed your question, as there are so many of them. And for the sake of time, I think now we have to move on to the next presentation.
So for those who have any more questions, please feel free to email directly to Anne, or even you can directly send the email to me and then I can forward it to her. So thank you, Anne, for giving us a good presentation, and it's a good learning for us as well on your studies. And we do hope this study will be extended further. So I think there's a lot of research needed to look at this issue in the Bahamas. So thank you, Anne. All right, so moving on for our second presentation, we would like to invite Dr. John Cunningham. You are free to share your screen now.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Vic. Thank you to the Research Edge team. I will share my screen with my presentation. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay. All right. I trust that you can see that. See the screen. All right.
No,
so
you don't see
can
your
you?
screen. No.
You can see. Okay. Wonderful.
We-
Sorry, you wanted to say something?
I'm trying to see. Can everyone see the screen?
Oh, no.
We can see Dr. Cunningham.
Yeah.
Oh, you can't. Oh, I'm so sorry. Sorry. I'm sorry. There's.
Okay.
There we go. My apologies. Okay. So my presentation, thank you for having me. And this is entitled The Science of Artistic Expression, Neuromechanics, and Piano Playing. Now, unlike the previous presenter, this is not a paper, one self-contained paper, but it is more of an area of my research interest. And so I'm going to, right now I'm in the process of writing a series of papers on many of the ideas and concepts and research that I've done over the course of the past few years, particularly as it relates to my dissertation work, which I successfully defended in 2019, where I looked at, so this topic really looks at many topics, including historical pedagogy, where I look at 400 years of pedagogy, of keyboard pedagogy specifically, keyboard being keyboard instruments, not just limited to the piano, but also organ, a harpsichord, and other period instruments. Then I look at scientific considerations that really relate to piano playing. I've also looked at piano technology, where I look at the machinery, the technology that comprise of the instrument. I also look at proprioception, and my two in-depth research studies that I'm doing is a survey study, some of which I will present to you, and then a study on motor control in piano playing, where I look at wrist orientation and finger function. So yeah, so that's kind of an overview. I wondered how to begin this presentation, and I decided I wanted to let you know a little bit about my background. What is this whole notion of piano playing and neuromechanics? Because it's not something that's talked about a lot. And so I thought I would give you a little bit of my history. And sorry, okay, here we go. So they say a picture paints 1,000 words, so I really want to share that. So I am born and raised here in the Bahamas, born to an Andros mother and a Crooked Island father. And I'm a child of the 90s, so I'm old enough to remember when the Cable Bahamas became a company. So so growing up, options were to watch ZNS or to go and play outdoors. And on one of those occasions, I remember being introduced to Francis Fox, who at the time was putting his performances on ZNS TV. And that really inspired me. And then Dawn Sands, who's the lady in the lower corner, she was the only teacher that I had growing up here in Nassau. And she kept me excited about piano playing. And it is to her I give sole credit for my theoretical and practical foundations growing up. And then Don Betts, who I met as a student at Macalester College, where I did my undergrad studies, he was the first one to expose me to the technical studies and truly a love for the classical piano works. But my focus was not solely on music. I was a biology major, which was my great passion during my years and studies at Macalester. And then later on, I would go on to be a master's student at the Peabody Conservatory and met Marian Hahn, who significantly changed my technical approach to the piano. She encouraged me to read a lot of books that discuss piano playing, but also human physiology, which was awesome because I had never thought before to combine those two areas together, even though I was a biology major. And then Leslie Felbane, who was professor in the theater and dance department, who was certified in Alexander and craniosacral therapy. She helped me to understand body awareness so fundamentally that it obviously had a positive impact on my own aspirations as a solo performer. And then also during those years of study, during my PhD program, I worked through as an assistant in the piano technology department, where I really began to understand the intricacies of the machine that I was to make my career on. And I didn't realize how rare that was when I was doing it, but it truly is in our field. And then I was diagnosed with cubital tunnel syndrome, which is a compression of the ulnar nerve that runs through the elbow joint. The ulnar nerve extends from the top of the arm all the way to the tips of the fingers. And what it forced upon me was a loss of sensation in my third, fourth, and fifth fingers. And this injury, because in a Doctor of Musical Arts degree, it's a series of 5 recitals, I had to figure out how would I survive with this injury. And so there was an option, instead of doing what most do, which is a series of performances, I decided to do a full dissertation that bridges the sciences and the arts, because I was personally dealing with this myself. And then I had no idea at the time that the University of Maryland, where I was studying, had one of the top kinesiology programs in the country, and Dr. Shim was a chair in the neuromechanics research core at the University of Maryland, not only helped me with my research, but also is a hand neuromechanics specialist and served as the chair of my dissertation committee. So that is how I came to this whole idea of neuromechanics and piano playing. So this is my great debatable idea. I believe that the world has a lot to gain from learning what it is that we as pianists and those of us that play piano do. But also in turn, we as pianists have a lot to gain from the knowledge that exists out there in the sciences, in engineering, in body practices, above all else. So I truly believe that piano playing is an untapped treasure trove for understanding neuromechanics, neuroscience, psychology, as well as human physiology and kinesiology in a larger sense. I truly believe that piano playing is ground zero for understanding the human body and human neuroscience at its most complex. And I want to begin with this theory of multiple intelligences. Now, I want to, during the introduction, Dr. Vicknair actually introduced me as being a part of the music department, which is half correct. I'm also a part of the School of Education. So my appointment spans both creative arts, but also in the education division, where I spend half of my time. And so I want to give regards to the School of Education and the leadership there. And it's there that the theory of multiple intelligence is really emphasized amongst educators. And the theory of multiple intelligence historically differentiates human intelligence into specific modalities, rather than seeing intelligence as dominated by a single general ability. And so you can see what those intelligences are. But what I would suggest to you is that musicians not only have to use these separate intelligences, but we as musicians, and particularly pianists, have to use and coordinate these in order to produce what is known as artistry or musicality. And then there's this kinesiology. What is kinesiology? It's the study of human movement, of which kinetics and kinematics, which I will get into a little later, is all about. Instrumentalists, we as instrumentalists must be able to develop sensory perception, motor skills far beyond the average population. Instrumentalists need an infinite number of degrees of freedom, and because every piece of music that we will play requires a different series of movements or technique, as it's called within music pedagogy. So really, it's a combination of the skeletal muscular system as well as the neurological system in order to produce what it is that what we have to do as musicians. And I propose this neuromechanical pathway for instrumental performance, where I talk about, and this is something that I kind of came up with myself. So we have this idea that an intention is formed, an artistic intention or a musical idea. And for us as classical musicians, it usually comes from the musical score. But for jazz and other genres of music, it can come from, divine inspiration. Then a movement, as a result of that artistic idea, a movement is produced in the body, which initiates a movement in the instrument. So there are two levels of movement we're talking about. It's the movement of the skeletal muscular system that produces a movement of the human body. But then there's also a mechanism. And in the case of the piano mechanism is very complex. And so I'm terming this instrumental mechanics, but really what it is biomechanics that are produced within the body. And then from there, sound is created. And then concurrent sensory skeletal muscular and auditory feedback is given where the brain processes this information, and then the cycle begins anew. Okay, so that is what I call the instrumental performance pathway. Now, why does piano playing, so Dion, there are a whole lot of instruments out there, and we understand this whole aspect of, music and how it's good for us in many ways, but so there are a lot of instruments. Why does piano playing particularly deserve particular study? And I will propose 4 reasons, as you can see there. So first of all, I think to be a pianist is to do one of the most complex things that you can do with your human body, just the human body side. There are more degrees of freedom that we have to use as pianists than any other instruments. Because only a handful of other instruments use all 10 fingers completely unrestricted in terms of placement. And that's what I mean. There are so many different combinations, and those combinations are generally determined by the musical score. And these 10 fingers not only just simply move to produce pitch, they are in charge of speed, there's dynamics, there's articulation, there are all of these aspects that are really important. And the use of the fingers in coordination with the playing arm, which is the wrist, forearm, elbow, shoulder joint, trunk, and pelvis, make it the most complex demonstration of fine motor control in human movement. And I truly believe that studying performance gives insight into so many aspects of human sciences, including ergonomics and lower arm coordination. One of the things I like to say to folks that I'm sharing this with is that in 2021, we're all pianists. And you may say, well, yeah, but I don't play the piano. But here's the thing. We're all using all 10 of our fingers in a very differentiated, fine way because of these machines that are in front of us, particularly today, called computers. And so we all need to understand how this works and to understand some of the challenges that are involved in this kind of coordination. Now, what are the needs? Like I said, that there are 2 sides to this. I believe that the world has a lot to learn from pianists, but pianists have a lot to learn from the rest of the world as it relates to the information and the academic literature that is out there. Because I believe for too long there has been this separation. And so what are the challenges that we and me as a pianist face? There are many challenges. We have needs due to the following. There's insularity, and I call it insularity because for the most part, in our field, despite our long history of developing pedagogy and methods, we have not traditionally had enough regard for the scientific and technological disciplines, specifically the human body, and particularly as it relates to the machinery of the piano. We don't have enough regard within our field. And that's reflected in the pedagogy that exists, but also in the training of conservatories and academic institutions from where this learning occurs. So for instance, when you go to any program in the world, there is no anatomy for musicians. There is no instrumental kinesiology classes. There is no piano technology that's required, which is interesting because we use our bodies in such a complex way, and we're playing a machine that is very complex. But yet, for most of us, if you if you ask us the question, how much do you understand about what you're doing physically, and how much do you understand about the machinery of the piano itself? Not very much. There are also other needs, the culture of non-consensus, even within piano pedagogy, outside of the fact that it is by and large not informed by scientific and technological disciplines. Even when you look within the field of pedagogy itself, there is not even consensus amongst us. We don't necessarily agree on the best path to producing artistry. And then there is this other point, and this is the last one that I'm going to share here, the discouragement of aspiring pianists. The labeling of students having technical or artistic shortcomings as being untalented without consideration for the efficacy of the pedagogical approaches or the structure and function of their innate physiology. There's also the lack of proprioceptive awareness, prevalence of injury, and the inherent problems of the instrument, which I will not be able to get into today. I've talked about the challenges of pedagogy, so I'm going to just skip that slide. And so what has it led to in our field? It has led to the following. It's led to the development and promotion of devices, exercises, and pedagogy outside of the purview of the human sciences, which I believe to be one of the big flaws in our field. And it has also contributed to the last 2 points here: belief that feeling and looking natural is equal to good technique and overall healthy playing. And of course, the last point, beautiful sounding playing, musicality equals good technique and hence healthy playing. So it's the look. Once it looks good, it's right. And if it sounds good, it's right. And I can tell you, and many of us, 80% of my field can tell you that that's not actually correct. Now, this whole idea of motor control, what really separates us as musicians from other mammals? And yes, we tend to think of the brain as being, oh yes, well, it's obviously our brain, but it's actually the hands as well. The hands really help to separate us from any other mammal. We like to compare ourselves in terms of, the evolution on which the scientific disciplines are based, to monkeys and other primates. But the hands is something that really separates us. Neurologically, the hands are one of the richest areas in terms of nerve endings in the body, which literally for pianists comes into play. And then, which is the diagram that I have here, what a lot of people don't know is that the hands, from a gross anatomy standpoint, are assigned the largest area of brain mass within the motor cortex. It is not the leg, which is larger. It's not the trunk of the body. It's the hands and fingers. And it's because of the degrees of freedom. It's because of the variety that's available to it. And pianists, above all other populations, get to develop this complexity more than any other group. And I think it really deserves special attention from both pedagogues and scientists, particularly from a neuromechanical and cerebral cortex development standpoint. I'm going to skip the slide. I know that time is going, so I'm just going to skip this, but we understand that learning, memory and psychology is one of those areas as it relates to piano playing that's really important. And I will simply say that to learn a piece of music and to understand the combinations that are involved, and then to superimpose on that, this aspect that for most of us, it's done totally from memory. So for a pianist, we're performing 100 pages of music in a typical concert, really deserves a lot more regard. And then on top of that, how do we separate normal, the typical church pianist, not to disparage church pianists, from a classical pianist? And it's really that consistency of high level playing from one performance to another. Health and injury. Now, this is really close to my heart, and it's really important because I truly believe one of the underreported stories is that we as pianists are injured as much, if not more so, than a typical Olympic athlete, okay? And so, but the difference between us and an Olympic athlete is that an Olympic athlete, because of the supportive practices that are around them, they are able to go to a resource and have the information as to what is going on. But for most of us as pianists, we don't understand because the injuries kind of come over a period of years. And most of us don't even know what the cause is outside of a general, I practice or I play too much. And the injuries aren't acute in the way that a track and field athlete would pull their hamstring or something like that. And so the usual recommendations that we get in the case of injury is rest and anti-inflammatories, which I think is grossly insufficient. And to drive the point home, Long and Leon Fleischer are two of the greatest pianists on the planet. Leon Fleischer, the late Leon Fleischer, both of them well regarded for their artistry, but both have suffered injuries because of approaches that were not conducive to not only their physical anatomy, but also the intersection of what they were doing from a movement standpoint to the instrument itself. And so Long has since, in his case, the Asian person on screen, he has returned to prominence, but he has not yet returned to the repertoire, the level of repertoire that he used to play. Physiological and anatomical considerations of piano technique. One of the myths that I want to debunk is this whole idea of what we call musical talent. And much of what we consider musical talent is in actuality physical talent. And so the abduction ability of the MCP joints, the stretch variability in the ligaments of the hand, variations in the joint articular surfaces, sex and gender differences. Yes, there are differences in the gross anatomy between men and women and how that impacts piano playing. And then of course, this whole idea of the ease of pronation, okay? This is also one of these areas that, because we as pianists, we spend 2 to 3 to 4 hours a day in a pronated state. And actually we can extend that to most of humanity, particularly this year. Most of us spend our time in a pronated state. And most of us don't realize that to stay in a pronated state for a long period of time actually invites tension. So the tendinitis, the carpal tunnel that we feel in large part is due to this hours of being in a pronated state. And particularly as pianists, we are particularly susceptible to this. I'm going to skip ahead of the physical, and I'm going to skip over the kinesiological aspects because that is, I don't have the time to get into that. Like I said, this topic is a huge one. And I thought, it would be better for me to kind of give an overview of what are my areas of research interest. I want to jump ahead really fast to the survey studies that I've done. And what I did was I surveyed 145 pianists. Yes, I surveyed 145 pianists, of which 77% achieved a bachelor's degree or higher. So we're not talking about somebody who's played piano for 5 years or something like that. We're talking about people who want to establish their careers in this area. And I used the Qualtrics survey platform. And what I wanted to really see was, what are the areas that are important to or unimportant to piano playing and teaching by the lack of its inclusion in private and institutional study? What requires input from other fields, and how could our field be improved from a health and human performance standpoint? And I have a number of graphs here, but what I am going to point out is 2 of them. This one here. So participants that have experienced pain. So 145 pianists, you can see here that 80% of them, 80% of those that I've studied have experienced pain and injury as a result of this. Well, 22 being pain, figure 22 being experienced pain. And then injury, the way I differentiated it in terms of the graphs is injury to the point where you actually had to stop playing piano playing for a period. And so in any other field, now what does this 80% mean? A pandemic is really classified at about 7% or 8%. So if 80% of people in a field are experiencing pain as a result of their profession, it really suggests that there's something not quite right either in the pedagogy, something that's not quite in the instrument. And so it really deserves attention. And it is my goal to really try to bring awareness to this area. And then you start to see in some of these other graphs, the lack of study. We as musicians don't study injuries. We don't study, we don't even participate as much in non-piano exercises or practices to aid in piano playing, partially because that is an area that we still need to develop. In athletic performance, there are aspects that, it's not expected that the coach be the authority on all things athletic. There are other areas that support that, but we as pianists don't have that at all, and so we're really kind of left to our own devices in many ways. And then you start to see the divergence in terms of areas of the body that are believed to be important in piano playing, Because believe it or not, as pianists, we don't just simply play with the fingers, we play with the whole mechanism. There's a coordination there. And then you start to see as well the relative height of elbow to keyboard. There's variation. So there's a lot that still needs to happen in terms of standardizing approaches to piano playing itself, and then having those be informed by other disciplines as well. Because like I said, there hasn't been this meeting of the minds as it relates to the body, the technology, and the production of artistry. And as you can see, the wrist and forearm are the areas that most pianists point to as being the areas that are most susceptible to pain, which caused me to ask a different question. Okay, so what is it about the wrist that is so painful? And so my next study, which I'm going to talk about now, looked at motor control in piano playing, where I looked at, and there's a lot of writing there, but basically what I looked at is how wrist orientation actually impacted individual finger strength and control. Okay, how the movement of the wrist, the various orientations that we use as pianists actually impacted the strength, the speed, and control of the fingers. Okay, and yes, and because it's the area of most trouble for us. So my aims were to investigate the effects of lateral wrist orientation on maximum volume, and to investigate differences between pianists and non-pianists in their finger strength and control. What is physiological and what is neurological or training related? And I had some hypotheses there, but basically what I discovered from, and this is here, kind of my experimental design. We used a room at the University of Maryland to set up this study where we had pianists come in and use different pianistic techniques, and then we analyzed the data using frequency and time domains. We used the LabVIEW program to do that. And the next slide really shows that as well, this particular graph, I just picked out one, and what it shows is that thumb and index finger exerts the greatest force at the piano when the wrist is positioned laterally away from the body, and then the third, fourth, and fifth fingers exert more force when the wrist is neutral, when the wrist is oriented towards the body. Which you may think, oh, well, that's kind of that makes sense because of the tendon connections from the forearm to the fingers. But you would be surprised to know that that's not an aspect that is included in the pedagogy, in a lot of the pedagogy that we use today. And yes, recommendations and practical advice for pianists in the field as a whole. I really believe we need multidisciplinary partnerships. I think we need to require that in schools of music and conservatories that there be courses related to scientific disciplines for instrumentalists. There needs to be a culture of openness and injury, because that's one of the other things as a pianist, I can tell you that there's not this culture of openness when we're hurting. I also believe that we need to emphasize the body as being equally as important to the musical score. For too long, we've functioned in this way that, oh, well, if it sounds right and it's obeying the score, then it must be right. But then 80% of us are injured. I also believe that there needs to be warm-up and cool-down routines, breaks at regular intervals. We need to engage in practices and exercises that are away from the piano that could assist in overall health. And then I believe that we need to have an off-season during a performance or a teaching session. Particularly because one of the things I also discovered was piano teachers tend to be more susceptible to injury than actual pianists. So that was a whirlwind, I know, and Dr. Vic, all I can say is that in order to delve into these areas more deeply, I would appreciate another opportunity to come back and share any one of these areas on deeper levels, but that is my overview, that is my research interest, and I thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you so much, John. It was really a great presentation. We have learned a lot more today on piano than ever. So this is a good example of how research can come out of from the music department as well. It's not just composing, but I think carrying out this kind of research, which is as critical. So there are a few questions in the chat. There's one question which I wanted to pose as well from Frankie Camille. What role does playing the piano have on the physical development of human beings? And what is the psychological and physical benefits of learning the piano at an early age? I had the same question because I have a young daughter who's also into playing piano, and sometimes I wonder whether can she really pick up at that age. At the same time, you also see these prodigies, piano prodigies is getting younger and younger, and how are they managing in playing so excellently? And when I look at your research, there's a lot more that you need to understand before you even start playing the piano.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so I'll try to give one answer to each area. So what does it, how does it affect the overall development of the human body? In the forearms, we have the flexor digitatorium profundus and the flexor digitatorium superficialis. What is that? Those are muscles that control the hands and fingers, but they're different. Why are there two sets of muscles? One set of muscles is engaged in power, in exerting power, and the superficialis, the flexor, this digitatorium superficialis, actually helps in speed. What happens with a lot of pianists is that we don't know how to differentiate or control one from the other. And so, but to answer the question, what you're developing is independence, right? Independence of use of these different muscularities, because what you have in the hands and fingers is a lot of redundancy. There's a lot of muscular redundancy that for most people who are not pianists or instrumentalists, they never develop. And to be honest, they probably don't need in their everyday existence. So what is our advantage? We have an ability to control these fingers at higher levels of complexity. So I would suggest to you that one of the problems we have in typing, because there is a connection between what it is we do as pianists and typing, which most of the world does, is that a lot of people, I suspect and I hypothesize that for most people, they're actually activating the wrong muscles in the use of the control of their fingers. And so that's what's leading to a lot of the tendinitis and carpal tunnel that's existing today. How do we develop that independence? Well, you got to become a pianist. But actually, what I will also say is that it's something that I haven't found any practices on, to this point. How does it affect brain development? What scientists know is that when we actually involved in piano performance, there are changes in the brain structure, and I don't mean from an esoterical standpoint. I mean, you can actually take the brain of somebody that's studied music and somebody that's not, and you actually see changes in the brain structure. And what they notice is that there are actually physical connections within the neurons and in the tissues of the brain, more connections between the left and right hemispheres. Because traditionally we tend to think of piano playing as being right brain dominated versus left brain, and so that myth has been debunked. And so what does this mean? It means that the use of the brain, the overall development of the brain, is at a much higher order level in musicians, particularly those that study the performance aspects, than those that don't engage in this particular area. So sorry, that was long-winded, but that's my answer to that question.
Another question from Dr. Jones, Paul Jones. Perhaps Dr. Cunningham could show those attending what a proper and improper approach to sitting at the piano, holding the arm, positioning the hand, or raise playing. Looks like right there at his home. Okay, may help people visualize better.
Okay, I'll play along. So here we go. So I will.
He spotted the piano.
You can see me, right? So yeah. I don't need to do anything. Okay, all right. So there are a couple of things that we need to understand. I'm going to start from the feet up. When we sit to the piano, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that there are 2 points of balance. The secondary point of balance is at the feet, right? And why I say secondary is because the feet are not just the point of balance, but it's also used to control pedaling. Pedaling helps to control the texture and sound that we produce at the instrument, okay? The main point of balance, though, of the piano is the pelvic bone, because it is from there that we have the ability to move. Piano posture is not something that is static, by the way. We tend to think, oh, posture, this is something that is fixed, but it's something that is very dynamic, and it's controlled by whatever the technical requirements are of the music. What are the movements that are involved from the pelvis? It is back and forth, but it's also lateral. The piano has 88 keys on it. So you have to be able to go from one side to the next. And the point of balance with some support from the legs is really the pelvis. What do we do with the hands and the arms? What do we do here? Well, what we need to make sure, it really depends person to person. But what you want to have is kind of a parallel position. Why is it important to have a parallel position? Because if you're too high, what you're doing is bending at a joint within the playing apparatus being from the arm, the scapula, all the way to the tips of the fingers. You're actually creating contractions there. So the neutral position, being a parallel arm, actually allows the joints within the playing apparatus to be at their freest, at their least impinged. You see a lot of people with the wrist down here. Well, what are you doing? You're impinging here at this joint and you're causing problems. But if you're too high, you're impinging. So that's why one of the issues that I'm really studying is this whole aspect of wrist orientation, because it is the most flexible of the playing apparatus, point of movement of the playing apparatus, but it's where we're getting all of the problems. So that's a Cliff Notes version of playing the piano. And then there's this aspect of pronation, because we don't play piano like this, we play like this. And so in a pronated state. And so from this point, we're able to move where we need to, using the pelvic bone as the point of balance. So that's a Cliff Notes version of piano playing, of what it requires in terms of posture.
I think everyone is waiting for you to play one song.
Okay, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what. So I said something as I was speeding through that presentation, and it's this idea that, oh, pianists play piano with their fingers. I am here to tell you that we do not play with our fingers, we play with the entire arm. And one of those areas that most people will never see, because we're moving at such a fast pace, is the pronation of the arm. So one of the areas that I talked about that are physiological consideration is our ability to pronate. If you have freedom in this ability to pronate, your ability to play will, you will have much more freedom at the piano. So I'm gonna do two things. I'm gonna try to play slow so that you can see, and I know most people, you go to the fingers, but I want you to notice that there is this pronation in and out, kind of side to side that's going on as I'm using my fingers. Why am I focusing on this? Because this is the second most problematic area for pianists. It's because of tightness in the wrist and tightness here in pronation. So there are things that we need to do. So if I'm playing, I'll play Mozart. Now what I'm doing is I'm actually exaggerating the movements of my forearm so that you can see that I'm actually involving it. Right? That's something that you'll never see at a high speed, but I'm just showing you that it's not just the fingers, it's the forearm that is involved. So when you play it at a high speed, it looks like I'm not doing anything, but I'm coordinating a lot of things that are involved in piano playing. So I'll play it at a fast speed. So you see, You may not see it. It's not might be perceptible to the eye, but that's what I'm coordinating as I'm playing. So yeah, thanks, Dr. Jones, for putting me on the spot.
So much for that demo. Really good. So, any more last question before we wrap up for the day? No more questions. So thank you once again, Dr. Cunningham and Dr. Ulentin for a great presentation today. Two different types of research, and we really appreciate you taking the time, both of you, to share your studies with us. And we do hope you all the best in continuing the studies. These are the studies that I think will be very useful for the country. So with that, I would like to conclude our first Research Edge session for this semester. Keep a lookout for the flyer for the next session in February. So until then, please do take care. Have a good weekend. Have a safe weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.